Welcome everyone to our first week in the Conlang workshop series. So excited to be hosting this, and I'm so excited for you to be making your own constructed languages. And maybe you're working on world building for a story. I think there's some writers in this workshop, and you want your fictional world to have its own unique language to maybe be more immersive, or maybe you just want a personal constructed language just for an outlet of creative expression. Maybe you want to make a conlang for international use. Maybe you want to use one for different people of different language backgrounds to communicate with each other. Whatever it may be, I'm really hoping that this workshop is gonna get you started with your conlang journey. Yeah, are you guys excited? Before we do any of the fun stuff, let's talk a bit about the workshop series. So again, this workshop is going to help you make your own conlang. You're going to be making your own conlang within the workshop. And the workshop is divided into sections, which will help you build certain aspects of your conlang. So first, we're going to talk about the introduction to conlanging. We're going to introduce what a conlang is. We're going to look at some conlang examples. Next week, we're going to start working on the sounds of your conlang. We are going to have kind of a bias with spoken conlangs, but if you want to make a sign language conlang, that's also perfectly fine. After this, we're going to start more of the wordy grammar of your conlang. We're going to look into words. We're going to look into things like morphology and syntax. How do sentences work? How does other grammatical aspects work? Next, we're going to look at your conlang in writing, and we're going to look at writing systems, how your conlang is written. And after that, we're going to put your conlang into context. So how does your conlang change in its environment, in its social environment? And specifically for this week, we just talked about the overview of the Conlang workshop series, so that's already checkmarked. Next, we're going to talk about what conlangs are, what purposes do they serve, and how they're made. And then we're going to explore existing conlangs just to get you an idea of what you might want to do for this workshop series. And then we're going to move on to our weekly task, which for this week is all about ideating your conlang. And you are going to be gaining a lot of surface level information about linguistics, especially for the second and third weeks, which is about sounds and grammar. But don't worry, we're not going to go into extreme detail about linguistics, since the focus for this workshop is more so on designing a language rather than actually dissecting those individual elements of language in general. Now, for this workshop series, if you do become much more interested in conlanging after the workshop, or if you're extremely interested now, you could read the book The Art of Language Invention by David J. Peterson. He's the guy who created a lot of conlangs for very popular media. He created languages for Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon. If you watch the Dune series, he created the language for the Fremen people. And a lot of big names in Hollywood kind of go for this guy when they need a conlang for whatever piece of media they're making. This workshop does follow a similar structure to the book, and I personally think it's a really cool resource to get much deeper into conlanging. So if you're interested, go check out the book. Now, let's talk about conlangs. I really want to talk more about what conlangs actually are, because I see a lot of misinterpretations about it from people who haven't conlanged before, but even by beginner conlangers, they sometimes get things about conlanging a bit wrong. So again, a conlang, or a constructed language, is a language that's consciously created. So the grammar is consciously created, the vocabulary is consciously created. It did not evolve naturally. And conlangs tend to serve some kind of purpose. That being said, conlangs are technically real languages. So a real language is, well, a language that's real. It's a language that exists, and it exists as a functioning language. So it has grammar, it has vocabulary, and it's used to convey meaning. And oftentimes we call conlangs fake languages because we compare them to natlangs, or natural languages. So these are languages that evolve naturally and were not created consciously. So I'm speaking a natlang to you guys right now. I'm speaking English. Some guy in history did not all of a sudden have the idea of creating a Germanic language that's about to be spoken by billions of people on Earth. English evolved naturally. And here at the top, we have some examples of natlangs in writing. So this sign has 5 natlangs. There's Japanese, Ainu, English, Korean, and Chinese. And in here, we have 2 natlangs. There's French and there's Breton, which is a Celtic language spoken in France. But because we push conlangs into existence, and conlangs do have grammar, conlangs do have vocabulary, conlangs do convey meaning, we can't technically call them real languages. So here's some conlangs in media. This one's called Atlantean for the movie Atlantis, which I find it to be an excellent movie. I don't like the sequel. Here's one of Tolkien's languages in The Lord of the Rings. Now that we know that Conlangs are real languages, it's also important for us to clarify what Conlangs are not. Conlangs are not codes, they're not ciphers, and they're not language games. These are basically algorithms made to shift the look of a language. Take Pig Latin, for example, and I'd like to redirect you to this image here of the Minecraft menu screen in Pig Latin. So take a language, let's say it's English, and move the first consonant of a word. So let's say the word is single player, move it to the back, attach A, so it becomes single player say, and do that to every word you say in English. It's still English, it still has English's grammar, it conveys meaning just like English, the only difference is the look is different. So that's a code. It's not its own conlang because it's English. Conlangs are not relexes, and oftentimes I hear a lot about beginner conlangers making relexes instead of conlangs unintentionally. And basically what a relex is you take the words of a language and you replace it entirely. So let's say we have English and I take each individual word or each individual affix. I make my own words and then put it back into its grammar. It's still going to be English. It's just different words. The main difference between a code and a relex is that relexes could be done in very random ways, while a code is more systematic. And if you know the rules behind a code, you could reverse that code. So let's say I know the rules behind Pig Latin. I can reverse this into what it would normally look like in English. Conlangs are not fake languages. Fake languages are kind of meant to mimic the look or sound of a language. And this reminds me of a few years back when a woman pretending to sign ASL got hired for a courtroom case, or I think it was some kind of courtroom proceeding, and she was caught for faking her ASL. On live TV, she wasn't using ASL, she was doing random gestures. Now, to us who do not sign in American Sign Language, we would initially think that she is using ASL, but to an ASL speaker, they would quickly catch her and say, yep, she's signing gibberish. So she was using a fake language. She was mimicking the look of ASL, but she wasn't even conveying any meaning. And I also have an example here in written form from the game Pokemon Sword and Shield. At first glance, it looks like a language. It looks like it has its own alphabet. And believe me, I tried to search it up. I tried to make sense of it. I tried to decipher it. It's all just random glyphs mushed together in a sign. If you know this, they do cleverly put the same order of glyphs in different signs, and it kind of mimics that written language feel, but it's not a language, it's just random symbols. I'm very sorry that you had to learn this. And now that we know what conlangs generally are, how are they made? So there's many reasons for one to create a conlang. We talked about it a bit before talking about the Conlang Workshop series. Maybe it's for personal use, or maybe you want to make a world building setting more immersive. Maybe you want to make something for a group of friends, etc., etc. So whatever it may be, we can actually separate conlangs into different types depending on their purpose. As per my experience, a really large bulk of the conlangs I see are artlangs, or artistic languages. So these are conlangs made for artistic, aesthetic, or fictional purposes. Think of Sindarin from the Lord of the Rings series or The Hobbit, created by Tolkien. Think of Na'vi for the Avatar series, specifically these blue people. Think of Klingon from Star Trek. These are artlangs because they're made for fictional purposes. It could be a personal language, which is just a conlang for personal use. And a lot of conlangs out there are personal languages. They're just made solely for the creator. We also have Auxlangs, auxiliary languages, where if you look like a few centuries back from today, you'll actually see some Auxlangs appear. They're surprisingly common in history. In recent history specifically. So these are made specifically for international communication or communication across speakers of different linguistic backgrounds. For example, Esperanto was made as a global language, and you also have Interslavic, which was specifically made for Slavic language speakers. And then you have a weird branch called Engelangs, or engineered languages. These are made to test some kind of linguistic effect. So I like to think of them as kind of an experimental conlang to see what would happen given some kind of linguistics or conlanging question. For example, we have Ithquil, and the goal of Ithquil was to see how we would convey as much information with as little time as possible, or as little sounds as possible. So take this very short sentence in Ithquil, for example, and this whole thing means, on the contrary, I think it may turn out that is rugged mountain range trails off at some point. We also have Lodgeban, and Lodgeban was meant to sort of play at the idea of linguistic relativity, which is this idea that language shapes thought. It's kind of a controversial topic, and we're not really going to get into detail on that for this Conlang workshop series. If you do want to discuss linguistic relativity and its sort of problems, you could ping me in the channel. We could also further divide conlangs into how they were formed. So if your conlang is made from scratch, so if your words or grammar are not drawn from an existing source, or specifically an existing natlang source, we can call that an a priori conlang. So for example, High Valyrian. High Valyrian is pretty much fully created by David J. Peterson. He did use the book as a reference, but 99% of the grammar, the vocab, was made by him. And this one is a pretty significant scene in Game of Thrones for some kind of Valyrian variety, because we first see this character, Daenerys Targaryen, speaking a Valyrian variety when she says Zaldrizes Buzdaris Kosdaor, which I think means a dragon is not a slave. And we also have Ithquil, which is the Engelang that we mentioned earlier. It's a priori. It's not derived from an existing source. A posteriori conlangs, on the other hand, are drawn from an existing source. So for example, we have Esperanto, where much of the vocabulary stems from Latin. And we also have Belter Creole, which is for the series called The Expanse. And the premise of that series is that humans colonized much of the solar system, and we have different linguistic backgrounds interacting with each other in the asteroid belt, and they eventually formed their own Creole language. It comes from languages like English, French, Spanish, Slavic languages, Swahili, Hindi, I think, a bunch of widely spoken languages on Earth. And just note that deriving a conlang from an existing source is not the same as taking inspiration from an existing source. So you could have an a priori conlang that is inspired by the look of, let's say, Spanish or German, without taking any of its grammar or any of its vocabulary. So it'll still be a priori even though it takes inspiration from an existing source, but it doesn't derive from that source. Now, how are conlangs made? Well, generally it all starts with an ideation phase. We think of some kind of purpose, maybe for world building, personal use, maybe as an Auxlang, but I like to think of it as capturing the vibe of a conlang first. And during this phase, we also tend to think about what we might want to do for grammar, even though we're not going to work on grammar yet. So we're kind of capturing what we want to see in the language structurally. We may look for inspiration in other languages, in other natlangs, or in other conlangs. Once we capture that sort of vibe, generally we move into sounds. So we select our speech sounds, we select our consonants, our vowels, and we deal with allophonies. If we're working on a more naturalistic conlang, we look into how these sounds change within its environment. And when I say its environment, I mean that we look into how these sounds change in proximity to other sounds or where it is in the syllable. After speech sounds, we generally move into the morphology and syntax section. So this is much of the wordy grammar part. So we decide on how words are formed, and we decide how words play with each other in a sentence, how our sentence is structured. We ask questions like, is the sentence going to be structured more flexibly, or is it going to have much more strict structure? If it's more flexible, how do words reflect their role in a sentence? So there's a lot of questions that come into the third phase. And after all that structural grammar part, we talk about visual design, so our writing system. And I put this phase as the fourth phase because writing is generally not regarded as an actual aspect of a language's structure. So writing is not really a linguistic phenomenon, it's more of a socio-cultural phenomenon, because rather than being a part of its grammar, it's more so a medium in which language is expressed without the use of the human body. But after the visual design part, we can put our conlangs into context, especially for world building. How does this language change within its culture? How does it change within its society? What does cultural nuance look like in the language? What does figurative language look like in this language? Much of this Conlang workshop series is going to follow this process because I do want some kind of formatted way to nail down the basics for you guys. But I just want to remind you now that there is no single way to make a conlang. After this workshop series, or even within this workshop series, when you start working on your own conlang all by yourself, you're going to see yourself do a lot of back and forth action. So maybe after sounds, you work on grammar, and then you decide, oh, I don't really like the speech sound. So you go back to the sound section, and then you jump to the writing section, and then maybe you want to change something in the grammar because it doesn't fit your writing system. Maybe you want to change your writing system because it doesn't fit your grammar. The Conlang process I just showed you is really malleable, and you don't have to start with sounds, or you don't have to start with wordy grammar, or you don't have to start with the writing. You could start in any of these phases. So you could start with sounds and then work on the writing and then work on the other grammatical aspects. But really, it's all about revision. And when you're making a very serious Conlang project, you're going to see yourself revising a lot of things. Now, with that being said, I think you're ready to look into some Conlangs, and then we could talk about our Conlang task for this week. The first Conlang I want to talk about is Quenya, and Quenya is one of Tolkien's Conlangs for the Lord of the Rings series, for the Silmarillion, and it's used by elves of Middle-earth, and it's more so for ceremonial usage. Sindarin is what's typically used for day-to-day speech, while Quenya is kind of regarded as having higher status. And Tolkien took a lot of inspiration from languages like Welsh and Finnish. It uses an Abugida script called Tengwar, and we're going to talk more about Abugidas on our fourth week. Very basically, what they are is that you have a symbol, for example, this one, which represents the consonant L. And if you attach diacritics over it, so if you put symbols above it or below it or beside it, it's going to change the vowel it's associated with. Tolkien designed this conlang to inflect nouns based on numbers, so nouns change depending if they're singular or plural, may it be a suffix or maybe a vowel change. And it also changes based on case. So there's 10 cases, and we're going to talk more about cases and number on our third week, but very generally what cases are is, think of it as like the role of a noun in a sentence. And what I find cool about Quenya is that subject and object pronouns are suffixed to the verb. Take the verb utuvie, or the root utuvie, which means have found. If you attach nye and s, it becomes I have found it. I read that it's a remnant of an older form of Quenya when the sentence structure was verb, subject, object, so the subject goes after the verb. Quenya evolved, the subject nouns became uttered before the verb, the subject pronouns remained after the verb, and it became suffixes. So Tolkien did think about linguistic evolution as well. Another conlang I want to show you, and you've probably heard of this, is called Esperanto, which was created by Zamenhof, who was an ophthalmologist. So he was an eye surgeon, and he grew up in a very multilingual community, and he had this dream about a world without war, and to him that was a world without linguistic barriers, world without cultural barriers. And he thought, you know what, maybe an international auxiliary language is gonna solve that. Although Esperanto probably didn't really live up to being a totally global language, it was pretty successful, and I feel like this is probably one of the most successful Auxlangs out there. There's really big Esperanto communities in places like Hungary and China, and there's even native speakers of Esperanto. I find that totally crazy. So Esperanto has 0 irregularities in its grammar. So once you know the rules of the grammar, there's no exceptions in its grammar, so you pretty much know the language if you nail the grammar down. It's heavily derived from European languages, despite its goal being a global language. Much of Esperanto comes from Latin, especially the words. And it's kind of a dilemma with making an Auxlang for the purpose of being a totally global language. So if you derive words more so from a certain language family or a certain language, then there's going to be a bit of bias. But if you try to even it out and derive words much more evenly from languages across the globe, it's going to sound a bit more alien. So it's kind of a dilemma when it comes to making an international Auxlang. Parts of speech, tense, number, case, etc., are formed using suffixes. So if you know how a word ends, you know what it's doing in a sentence, and you know what part of speech it is. For example, all singular nouns end in o, all plural nouns end in oi, all adjectives end in a, all present tense verbs end in as, past verbs end in is, etc. So it's very, very regular, and it's made to be much more easy to learn for people. Similarly, we have Toki Pona, which I think is a pretty fun conlang. It means the good language or language of good, and it's created by Sonia Lang, who is a Canadian linguist and translator. I would consider this as kind of a blend between an Engelang and an Artlang. So it's made to be a minimalistic conlang, and it has less than 140 words. It has only 9 consonants, and it has 5 vowels. There's no affixing or inflections. A lot of the words are derived from languages like Tokpisin. I think 40% of the language is derived from Tokpisin, but I might be getting that number wrong. It derives words from Esperanto, Mandarin, Finnish, and so many other languages. And because it's so minimalistic and there's really only a few words to use, it heavily relies on large phrases to convey much more complex ideas. Take the word luka, for example, which means 5. If you want to say the word 50, you have to say luka, 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 luka. You have to say luka 10 times, at least from what I know about Toki Pona. It actually created a large language community across the globe. And certain people in the Toki Pona community did create writing systems. The creator of the language, Sonia Lang, created her own writing system for Toki Pona called Sitelen Pona, which means the good writing or writing of good, which you could see here. It's a logographic system, which means that each word is represented using a written symbol. Those are conlangs created by other people, and now I'm going to show you some of my conlangs. A really big project that I had in the past was Duryk. I consider it more of a personal conlang of mine, but I did use it in a world building project where we created our own countries and we had our own languages. The thing about Duryk, I did take its evolution into account. While the writing of an older form of Duryk remained constant throughout history, sound changes occurred. So you might see words that do not match the way it's pronounced. We'll talk more about elisions in the future, but when a sound is elided, that means it pretty much gets deleted. Consonants become elided when they're not next to a vowel. So when they're not next to a vowel, it's just going to disappear, even though it's going to be written in its writing system. And vowels in words change to reflect noun case, number, or verb tense. So we tend to call this a blout. You see it in German. For example, the word Maus in German means mouse, and Mäuse means mice. So the vowels change. You also see it in English, and you see it in other Germanic languages. Though in Duryk, I feel like it kind of takes this a step further and maybe a bit much more complex. So take the word ngokug, which means eye. If you say ngik, it means in the eye, or if you say ngikek, it means of the eyes. One of my other conlangs is Sheikah, and this is a fan-made conlang for the Legend of Zelda series, specifically Breath of the Wild. This is another example of kind of shifting that conlanging process. So I started by looking at the shrine names of the game. So for example, Shivanir or Boshkala. In my Sheikah conlang, it would be pronounced as Shiavaner or Boshkala. And I took the spelling system and I tried to make sense of it. I tried to determine what these vowels could possibly represent in phonology. It looks a bit messy because the shrine names in The Legend of Zelda are kind of all over the place, but I created a really fun sound system out of that. And I also used the shrine names for vocabulary building. For example, Sheavaner means northern memory, and Poshkala means wise and guiding breath. And it kind of relates to the quest within the shrine in the game. So Sheikah has a very, very complex particle system. At least in Sheikah, you could think of particles as function words, grammatical words, which determine the role of other words in that sentence. So it follows a topic comment structure where the topic of the sentence goes at the front of the sentence. So take this first sentence, for example, we are free to go to Kakariko village on a horse. Chuki Kakariko jerichichela ruas katakatat. So Chuki Kakariko refers to Kakariko village, and Iche is the topic particle. But Iche is specifically a topic particle if your topic acts as a directional location. So if it acts as a place you are headed to. Or take this other example here. Could you buy me some mighty bananas? Yes, mighty bananas are a thing in the game, by the way. So Yokurnamika refers to mighty bananas, and that's being framed as the topic of the sentence. But let's say you want to make you the topic of the sentence. Could you buy me some mighty bananas? And in Sheikah, maybe you'd say that to bring into question your ability to buy me mighty bananas. So it might be a bit of a rude statement. Or maybe you're questioning if you are going to buy me mighty bananas or if someone else is. In the first sentence, it's la ke, which refers to you, and la is the subject particle for ke, which is not a topic. But if we frame ke as a topic, it becomes ke en, and en refers to the topic particle if the topic acts as the subject of the sentence. So ke en yokur namika una na olosh kajie. Could you buy me some ID bananas? A very recent one of mine is called Fiurian. So this is a personal a posteriori romance conlang with a lot of Greek, Arabic, and even Italian influences. So I kind of gave it real world lore. And when I say romance, I don't mean like lovey-dovey romance. I mean romance as in the romance languages like French, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, Romansh, etc., etc. So it's spoken in the fictional island country of Furia, which I set in the Mediterranean Sea. It uses the Latin alphabet. Because of the sound changes that occur in the language from Latin to Fiurian, or specifically from some dialect of Vulgar Latin or Proto-Romance to Fiurian, it developed very extensive rules on articles, on prepositions that are based on gender, number, and nearby sounds. So in this passage, I do have one example to share with you. So lu refers to the very generic masculine article the. So lu masir is like the promenade, or Lu Casteju, which means Castiaru, or the Castiaru, which is the name of the capital of Furia. If the masculine word starts with a vowel, for example, archipelago, which means archipelago, in writing, you're going to write the article as L-O apostrophe and attach it directly in front of the word. But when you say this, it kind of mutates that first vowel a bit. So instead of lo archipelago, you're going to say it as lorchipelago. So a lot of sound changes come into play in this language. Now that we looked at, I think we're enough conlangs, let's talk about your task. So for this week, I want you to start ideating your conlang that you're going to use throughout this workshop series. So give us some ideas you have for a conlang that you want to work on. So I want you to define the purpose of your conlang. So what kind of conlang are you making and what is it for? You could use the terms like Artlang, Auxlang, Engelang if you want, or you could just describe the purpose of your conlang. Why do you want to make this, aside from it being part of the workshop series? Who speaks your conlang? So if you're making a conlang for world building purposes, what's the social setting of your conlang? Or if it's just for personal use, you could just say you are going to speak the conlang. Although we did not talk about grammar yet, we didn't talk about phonology, we didn't talk about the wordy grammar part, as I like to call it. Try to conceptualize aspects of your language anyways. Try to think about grammar already. What do you want it to sound like? Or are you taking inspiration from existing natural languages? And if so, what languages are those? What grammatical features are you going to consider, knowing what you know about existing natlangs? What writing systems do you want to consider? Do you want it to have its own writing system? Or maybe you want to use an existing writing system like the Latin alphabet or the Thai abugida. Or you could have your conlang purely spoken or signed. So I'm going to be making a conlang with you guys, and I already did this task, and this kind of what I want you to do for this task. So here's my conlang idea. So it's specifically for world building purposes, but I think it's going to be a bit of a personal language as well. I'm thinking that's more of an Artlang. Like I'm trying to focus on the aesthetics of the conlang. So how it looks visually. I kind of want to focus on writing. I also want to focus on how it sounds. Like I want it to sound aesthetically pleasing, at least to my biases. So I'm thinking that these could be spoken by these winged creatures that reside in mountains, caves. Maybe they're vampiric, they live in the dark, they're like bats. And again, it's for world building purposes. I might use this for a D&D campaign, for example. And I kind of want that mysterious vibe with it. I kind of want their origins in the mountains to be ambiguous. You know, why did they come to the mountains in the first place? For the grammar, I'm thinking that I'm going to look into Balkan languages and languages in the Caucasus, like Georgian, Archi, Abkhaz. Specifically for phonology, I kind of want the phonology to be complicated. Specifically, I kind of want a lot of consonant and vowel clusters in the first part of the syllable, but when the syllable ends, I'm thinking that maybe I could keep it simple, like maybe just one consonant allowed. I do want complex affixing, so I kind of want the grammar to maybe mimic Hungarian or maybe look like what you see in the Caucasus. So this is what my ideation looks like on paper. Very, very messy. Well, it actually looks quite clean because I was conscious about this conlang being for the Conlang Workshop series, but on a normal day of making a totally new conlang, this paper is going to be dripping with ink. It's going to have ideas all over the place. Personally, my creativity thrives in chaos. If you're a much more organized person and you like to think in an organized space, that's totally fine too. So do whatever makes your creative juices flowing. Do whatever makes you think more creatively. So I started with drawing who speaks my conlang, these creepy angel winged humanoid people that live in caves and live in mountains. They probably excel at masonry and stonework, so maybe they have a lot of statues and pillars all over the place. And because of that, I'm thinking that maybe it kind of influences how they're going to write. Initially, I kind of thought of maybe a curvy writing system, maybe one that kind of looks like Armenian or Georgian. But I feel like if they write on stone every day, it's not going to be that practical. And I think much more straight lines in their writing would make more sense. I tried that first. To me, it looked really ugly, so I scrapped that and decided to think of the writing another time. I created a bunch of gibberish words in the Latin alphabet, and I talked about vowel clusters a lot. Like here we have a cluster of 7 vowels. Here we have a bunch of more vowel clusters. Like what I did for Duryk, I like the idea of having the writing system reflect an older form of the language. This may not be pronounced as it looks. So once I had that nailed down, I kind of went back into the writing. I tried to make this look much more geometric, which I thought I was getting somewhere. So I kind of considered it. And then I went over here in the other side of the paper and I made these random doodles. And I thought, hey, that looks kind of nice. And I think maybe it's because of the spaces between the lines, or that it looks like swirls but more geometric. So I kind of played at those glyphs and I tried to like mutate it a bit here. And I think I'm gonna make a writing system that kind of mimics this. I'm kind of vibing with this. For this task, there are some rules I want you to follow. Please use complete sentences when you're fulfilling this task. I want you to write it in the Conlang table. And again, describe the purpose of your Conlang, a description of your Conlang speakers or setting. If it's a personal Conlang, just say you're going to speak it. And think about grammatical concepts already. You don't have to work on the grammar now. Just think about what you'd want to see in the language. Feel free to describe or show your ideation process. So if you made a bunch of doodles on paper, like what I did here, send it to us and we could see how your ideation process worked. Or if you're very organized and you made like a full bullet pointed list on a notebook or on a whiteboard, go ahead and send that to us. You know, it's exciting to see how you think about your own Conlang. So post this submission on the Conlang table and make sure to put a tag on the Conlang table so that it's easier for me to find it. I will be posting this rule set and what I want you to do for the task on the Conlang table, so you don't have to scavenge through the slides. You look at the pinned messages. Now, if you are feeling stuck, I did make some Conlang prompts for you. Maybe you have a world building project and it's fantasy, sci-fi, or alt history. You could make a Conlang for that. Or maybe take a piece of media that you enjoy, like what's popular now, Arcane, Pokemon. Think of a conlang in that setting. Think of a piece of media that you know doesn't have a conlang and maybe make a conlang for it. Maybe make a secret language made for you and your inner circle of friends. Maybe it's like an esoteric, creepy language you keep hidden in the dark. Or maybe interpret what a language would look like in thousands and thousands of years. So you could make an a posteriori conlang and excessively change the look of the language. Or maybe take a conlang where a bunch of the words and expressions are based on something you enjoy, like cooking, plants and animals, visual art. They did try to make a conlang once. It's an a priori conlang and all the words were derived from the Latin taxonomic name of different life forms. So, for example, octopus would be, I can't remember, I think it was octope. And from that word, you can derive other words, like knowledge would relate to octopus, maybe. So, knowledge would probably be octopane, or maybe I would suffix that word with other words. So, if you're feeling stuck, you could refer to these Conlang prompts. And with that, we reached the end of our first workshop, guys. You did so well. Do we have any questions in the chat? Do you have any questions about the material? Do you have any questions about the Conlang workshop series? Do you have any questions about the task? Don't know if I have the creative ability to actually manage this. Everyone has creative ability in something. We just have a different process of making something. And we do get stuck a lot of times. I feel stuck all the time when I want to work on a Conlang project. It's totally normal. It's totally fine. But we can talk about it more in the channel. We can try to throw back and forth some ideas. How do you decide on which one to start if you have multiple ideas? Ooh. Save all of those ideas. You could make conlangs out of any of those. Maybe You could start with a more simple idea. Like this workshop is for beginners. Maybe do one that you think would be easiest to work out on. Or you could give yourself a challenge and use like a harder idea of yours. You could flip a coin. You should share your ideas with us in the Conlang table and we'll see what we could work out. Maybe you could like fuse these ideas together. But yeah, for this week, get your creative caps on and ideate, ideate, ideate. All right, so if we don't have any more questions, if you do have a question, feel free to bring it up in the Conlang table. If there's no more questions, as we say in one of my Conlangs in Fiurian, Geji, or thank you. Thank you so much for coming to the first week. I'll see you in the Conlang table to discuss your ideas, and I'll also see you in the next workshop where we bring those ideas to life, where we start with the speech sounds of your language. All right, and with that, thank you for joining. I'll see you in the next one.